For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alyssa Hunt. I am the Program Director of the Alice Paul Institute, and it is my absolute pleasure to host this program this evening on reparations, why economic justice is gender justice. It's an issue very close to a lot of our hearts, and I'm very excited to have our guests with us tonight. Before we get started, I would like to make our land acknowledgement, even though we are not gathered at Paulsdale tonight. All of us who are in South Jersey are gathered in part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation. The Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with the territory. In our acknowledging of the continued presence of Lenape people and their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. I would also like to remind you all as we get going of our program code of conduct. We're grateful to all of you for joining us today, and we invite you to share your questions during our Q&A period at the end of the program. We also love when people introduce themselves and share relevant thoughts and ideas in the chat box. Please remember that this space is intended for comments and considerations relevant to the program. Additional feedback can be shared with us via the response form we email to all registrants after each program. We are dedicated to making all our spaces, virtual and otherwise, safe and inclusive for everyone. Harassment of any kind will not be tolerated in verbal or written comments during API programs. If anyone chooses to engage in racist, sexist, trans or homophobic speech, or any other kind of harassment or bullying behavior, they will be removed from the program without further warning. Thank you for being a part of our community and for partnering with us to make sure we remain dedicated to equality for all in word and deed. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guests tonight. Joining us for this program are Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter and Jean-Pierre Brutus. Assemblywoman Sumter entered the New Jersey General Assembly in 2012. She has served in the executive leadership as Deputy Speaker and Majority Conference Leader. She currently represents the 35th Legislative District that includes parts of Bergen and Passaic County. She serves as Chair of Assembly Committee, Community Development and Affairs, where she looks forward to tackling important issues such as community blight, the wealth gap, and upscaling the needs of New Jersey's small businesses. She is also a member of the Labor and Commerce and Economic Development Committees. She is a staunch advocate for job growth, women's health, voting rights, civil rights, and criminal justice reform. Assemblywoman Sumter received her master's in business administration from the Fairleigh Dickinson University Silberman College of Business and her bachelor's in political science from Keene University. Assemblywoman Sumter has been married for 22 years to her husband, Kenneth, and together they have 2 children, a daughter, Tyler, and a son, Kenneth. Jean-Pierre Brutus is Senior Counsel in the Economic Justice Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Prior to joining the Institute, Jean-Pierre worked at Bronx Legal Services, where he represented indigent Bronx tenants facing eviction in various courts and administrative proceedings. Jean-Pierre is a 2007 graduate of Georgetown University, graduating with a major in sociology and a minor in African American studies. As a graduate of the JD PhD program at Northwestern University, Jean-Pierre is a graduate of the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and he earned his PhD in African American Studies from the Graduate School at Northwestern University. Thank you for being here with us tonight, and bear with me, I am extremely pregnant and in the stage of pregnancy where I get out of breath very quickly, so I'm sorry for that. So we're going to jump right into our program now, and we're going to talk about reparations. So most people have heard the term reparations, but the context and depth of engagement of that term may vary widely from one person to another. So I'd like to begin tonight by asking each of our guests to explain what they are talking about when they say reparations, perhaps with a specific focus on policy and legislation from the Assemblywoman, and a more general explanation of social impact from Mr. Brutus. So what does this mean for New Jersey? And we'll start with you, Assemblywoman.
Thank you. And I don't envy you having to give the introductions because it's always hard, even when I hear my bio, but you did a fabulous job, and thank you. Thank you for having me here tonight. Thank you to the Alice Paul organization for taking up this topic. When we think of the word reparations, let's go to its root, and we're talking about repair for harms that may have been caused to an individual or to a group of people for a sundry of reasons. For us, and I'm happy to always partner with the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice because they've been with me since the beginning of introducing this legislation over 4 years ago. We are seeking a reparations task force that will look to work with thought leaders across the state, an 11-member panel to discuss what New Jersey's role was in the North Transatlantic slave trade. We had piers and ports in Cape May, in Perth Amboy. We had underground railroads that go from Patterson all the way up through Mahwah. We have a history that's steeped in slavery in the North, and we don't talk about it enough. As we have newcomers to New Jersey, it's important that this history is known. So one, we don't repeat the sins of the past. Two, so that we start creating repairs for the harms that were done. For Black folks who make up less than 40% of the population in the state of New Jersey, to have over-incarceration, over-use of force in the state of New Jersey, a huge wealth disparities gap. And as you mentioned, you're pregnant now, and I am, wishing all blessings and joy upon you for this occasion. Black women in New Jersey are in the bottom tier of being able to live through delivery. And we know that it's systemic and structural racism baked in the system. Being relegated to where you can live based on zip codes because of the color of your skin or your race is part of New Jersey's history. We're not looking to cast shame on New Jersey, excuse me, but we are looking for New Jersey to have an honest discussion. We are looking to have thought leaders put together a position statement paper on ways that we can begin to repair as we look to what role the federal government will play, what role our educational institutions will play, what role our courts play, what roles we as citizens in today's time will play. And I really want to thank people for joining this conversation for this, pertinent time. We ran a campaign with the Institute of Social Justice called Say the Word, because what I heard in the State House was, look, we're supportive of making sure that we try to right some of these wrongs, that we know there's a wealth gap. We know that there's overuse of force. We have it documented. We know that there was redlining and Black people could not buy homes where they wanted to buy homes. We know that the soil was tilled and you were not allowed to own, but can we call it something else? Why must we say the word reparations? And for us, there is no other word. The compromise was creating a task force. For the policy side of it, we haven't put a dollar figure to it because we truly want to take a deep dive into this space with thought leaders from New Jersey to sit down and really lay out what New Jersey's role is and put together some policies and plans so we can be very precise in the change that we're looking to initiate here in our state. So I'll hold there so we have some room for the additional questions we have scheduled for tonight.
How about Mr. Brutus?
First, I want to say good evening to everyone who's listening. I want to say thank you to Alyssa and to the Alice Paul Institute for having me on behalf of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And then I would also like to say thank you to Assemblywoman Sumter for her leadership on this bill and for being here tonight. And thank you for that wonderful answer. As Assemblywoman Sumter said, right, the Institute is leading on the Say the Word campaign. Right? I don't want to rehash what the Assemblywoman said, but in terms of having a broader reparations and what reparations is, that's part of the purpose of the task force. The task force will address what reparations means in New Jersey. But let's say we look at the work of the economist Sandy Darity and his partner Kirsten Mullen. Part of the way in which they define reparations is acknowledgement, redress, and closure. Right? Acknowledgement, part of acknowledgement that the state of New Jersey has already done in 2008 is apologize for slavery. That's symbolic, but we have to go beyond that. Part of acknowledgement would be, are there public education campaigns around understanding slavery in New Jersey, right? If you went to public school in New Jersey, well, what was your understanding? How were you taught about slavery in New Jersey, right? Why is it a surprise that as an adult in New Jersey, you find out that slavery happened in New Jersey? What's going on in the education system? How is it publicly memorialized in the state of New Jersey? So that would happen on the symbolic end, right? Those discussions in terms of acknowledgement. And then you move on to redress, right? Restitution, the material. How would you address the harms, right? The material harms created by slavery and the afterlife or the aftermath of slavery, right? Those could be policies and programs. And yes, that could be direct financial remuneration in the form of checks. And you'd have to identify the populations who would benefit from these programs and as well as these checks. So you could say, okay, first you have the descendants of people who were enslaved in the US from up until 1865. And then you have the period from 1865 to 1968, which we colloquially call Jim Crow, right? And then you have the period from 1968 onwards, right? Contemporary discrimination, the people who face ongoing discrimination. Some people might fit into all three of those buckets, but I think reparations would have to address all three of those areas, right? A reparations program that falls under acknowledgement, redress, and finally, what Sandy Darity and his partner have called closure, right? This is going to take time, right? Slavery was hundreds of years. Jim Crow was 100 years, and this ongoing period has been almost 100 years, right? So closure is going to take a lot of time. The more investment, the more population, Black people are empowered through reparations, the shorter this period of time, right? But it is going to take time. It's going to be a protracted process, and it's not going to happen overnight. But the more investment that happens through reparations, the more Black people are empowered through reparations, the shorter the period of time. And so that's how we can begin to think about reparations.
Thank you for those wonderful answers. And your answer actually really dovetails great into the next question I have for y'all. So I want to ask you to speak to the historical context of enslavement in the state of New Jersey. Many people may not know how prevalent the practice was here or how long it lasted. I actually learned, I'm not from New Jersey, I'm from Texas, and I learned from my husband, who is a native of the state, last week, that a significant portion of the state falls below the Mason-Dixon line. I had no idea. So Mr. Brutus, I'd like to start with you this time and ask you to speak to that, and then we'll go to you.
So Alyssa, just like you, I'm not from New Jersey. I'm from New York. But, just like New Jersey, right, and geographically might fall underneath the Mason-Dixon line, in its history and its politics, it falls also under the Mason-Dixon line, right? New Jersey was once known as a slave state of the North, right? It was a slave society from its inception as a colony in 1626, as a Dutch colony, and then it turned into an English colony in 1646, right? Enslaved Africans, right, came to labor, right, forced to labor in New Jersey, right? White settlers were incentivized to enslave people. Why? New Jersey created a racialized system of property distribution. White settling families were given 150 acres of land for just as incentive, just for coming, right? This is land, as you pointed out at the beginning, appropriated from Native American populations by forced land grabs, right? And then for each additional enslaved person that they had, they were given 150 acres of land, right? This is in the 17th century and the 18th century, right? Because of this massive need for labor, for production, right? And this began to shape New Jersey as a colony, right? Its politics, its culture, right? And so slavery was a critical part of its labor production. It would, part of what the production would be a surplus of grain, which would go to support enslaved people in the Caribbean, right? And so you had, and so this became part of New Jersey's society. And one of the ways ensuring slavery would continue was passing slave codes, and particularly in 1704, these harsh kind of codes, right, that would limit Black people's ability to move around, so such as curfews. They couldn't, congregate in groups of more than 5 because slave masters were concerned about insurrection and revolution and rebellion, right? So it limited Black life in all kinds of ways, right? Slave codes and slavery. Enslaved people could not own property, right? And in 1821, right, New Jersey passed a law. The state court found that the presumed status of Black people in New Jersey was that of enslaved, enslaved person. That means a free person in New Jersey, say you were a free person or you're a self-emancipated person in New Jersey, you had to overcome the presumption of being an enslaved person, which was hard to do to produce those papers, right? New Jersey was the only northern state to support and enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, meaning if you were a self-emancipated person from the South fleeing, all right, slavery in the South, and you came to New Jersey would go after you, right? They would deputize white people to patrol, to find Black people and send them back to the South, right? The only northern state to do that. By 1830, 2/3 of the enslaved population in the North resided in New Jersey. New Jersey was the only state in the North, right, to not support the 13th Amendment. It only supported the 13th Amendment after its ratification, right, by the federal government, right? So New Jersey was truly a slave state. It was truly a slave society. Okay? It's fundamentally part of New Jersey. So it wasn't simply an anomaly or the peculiar institution, some kind of oddity, something on the extremes. It was part and parcel of New Jersey. And I think we should address that when we think about slavery in New Jersey, how critical it was to New Jersey's wealth, to the racial wealth gap that we see now, right, to its history, to its culture, to its very ideas of itself. Right? In 1776, the New Jersey Constitution didn't even reference slavery. So there's a way in which there's a shame, right? There's an acknowledgement that this is something wrong, right? But we're not able to acknowledge that. And so this part of reparation is acknowledging that harm, acknowledging that wrong.
Well, thank you. A very thorough answer. Assemblywoman?
Listen, Jean-Pierre did a great job in doing a chronological history. And you being from Texas, know all about Juneteenth and the word not getting to Galveston, Texas, that we were free. New Jersey's history has a similar history to it, and most folks do not know this reality. So part of the uphill battle has been in these 4 years is socializing and educating New Jerseyans and like-minded folks and people interested in history on New Jersey's role. So this is not something to cause shame or embarrassment. These are facts. And what we truly want to do is come up with a document, because should the United States government come up with a dollar figure that they're going to provide restitution and a payment for, I like for New Jersey to have a work product that we know the number of people that were impacted. 2, another deep-seated urgency of now is some of the families still have relatives in their genealogical status that's still living. And that's important because we want to make sure that their lineage has an opportunity to not only receive an apology, but also to receive the repair of the wealth that was stolen from them for generations. And this is a connecting point for us. We keep kicking the can down the road, and you're talking about over 400 years. And then in the 200-year cycle, we're talking about what we're going to do and how do you restore and how do we come up with a dollar figure. It's not hard to figure out. We can do this. And here's another thought for you, that North Carolina, one municipality, actually came up with reparations for families who were harmed and wealth was stolen from them. California actually implemented the same bill, this same bill that I introduced in New Jersey. I introduced it first with my partners from the Faith-Based Community Institute of Social Justice and the Senate, and California actually passed it, and they have a task force that's working. So it's not hard to do. It really takes willpower and it takes courage to get beyond the blind spots and fear of what does the word reparations mean, and owning the sins of the past, but also celebrating the contributions of a race to the great state of New Jersey and the Garden State and the lucrativeness of our state and the richness.
Thank you. So you just spoke to this a little bit, but I want to take this opportunity, since you already brought it up, to dive a little deeper. So human slavery was generally, though not exclusively, outlawed, which we'll talk about if we have time, by the 13th Amendment, but we still feel its impact. We feel it through systemic structural racism. So I'd like for you to speak to some of the ways that manifests in New Jersey today. I know we just changed the term freeholder is a really obvious one, but there's so many I know.
Yes. So freeholder used to be was a term used for a person who owned land. And it was a racist term. Actually, my godmother, who held the seat before me, Elise Evans, as the Assemblywoman, submitted the first piece of legislation to have that word removed and have the county officers called commissioners for that purpose. It, by its nature, prohibited Blacks from voting if you did not own land. So again, rooted in the 21 counties in New Jersey. I talked about the overuse of force. We have reports that came out 2 years ago where there was an overuse of force in state police on Black people in comparison to others who may have committed the same crime. Statistically data-driven. The wealth gap disparities, the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice did a report a couple of years ago, and I believe a new report has come out most recently on the wealth gap between the median income for a Black family compared to that of a white family, and I'm sure Jean-Pierre will talk more about that. I mentioned maternal health because we've worked hard on this for decades at a time, where it's unsafe for a Black mother to deliver. In the state of New Jersey, First Lady Tammy Murphy has also been a champion of this issue in partnership with the women of the Legislative Black Caucus to elevate having our voices heard. You heard Serena Williams talk about her delivery experience when she said she was in pain, knew something wasn't right, and had to force and fight for her voice to be heard. Dads being escorted out of emergency rooms because they were advocating for their spouse to receive treatment, believing that there's no real pain when a Black woman says she's in pain. I mean, I heard countless stories from educated moms to moms with minimal resources that had the same experience in the state of New Jersey, let alone the data showing that we're in the bottom tier of the country for deliveries. So there's been plot after plot, let alone the pandemic, that showed a disparate impact on communities of color, Black communities, Latino communities who were in multifamily homes, worked in service industries, did not have the flexibility to work from home, and were financially devastated by COVID. Broadband access, when schools had to urgently move to remote and our students not having access to the internet in their homes, let alone portable devices to use for continued learning. So time after time after time, we've proven the impact, let alone what our communities look like, and the food insecurities that we're facing today are all rooted in the systemic racism inherent and baked into New Jersey based on all of the pre-colonialism and the 1800 timeline that was just outlined. So now we're trying to break down those concrete cracks and really repair and restore the ability to thrive for all persons in New Jersey and not based on the color of your skin.
Thank you. So as you've mentioned, you introduced specific legislation to create this task force, Bill A938. So tell us about your bill. Tell us why this is the crucial first step we need.
So this bill is a thought leader process. For the legislative process, the ability to make a law requires that we have thought put into it. It requires that we really work with our intellectual institutions, including our higher educational institutions, our community-based organizations, so that they bring all of those thoughts into one setting, one place. And we used to say into one table, now it may be on one Zoom, to talk through these structures and how we may write legislation that will have impact. It really is hard to shoot in the dark. To believe that you're going to have legislation that's going to have impact or appropriate funds to repair a harm and you're missing the mark. I like to compare it to going to a doctor and continuing to get the wrong diagnoses, but you keep showing up and the bills just keep piling up high. Having a reparations task force with 11 people from across the state talking about all the different areas from housing to economics to education to health to human services, senior services in one setting is historic. It will tell us where the gaps are, where we've made some improvements, because work is still happening. By no means am I saying we have not progressed further along than we were. By no means am I saying that we're not doing the work to undo the harms and to allow people to thrive. In law enforcement, right? We did a lot of bills around civil justice reforms, decriminalizing low-level offenses of possession of marijuana, those type of acts, bail reform. All of those things are part of creating the repair, because we had a higher percentage of persons incarcerated for crimes. And then you're locked out of employment opportunity and the ability to earn decent wages, livable wages in the state of New Jersey. So this legislation will pull those thought leaders together to put together a report that will give us focus. And we've done it. We did it to create an independent prosecutor's bill in the state of New Jersey. We did it for a juvenile justice task force to first look at how we can change the juvenile justice system. We did it for COVID relief and pandemic relief. So having a task force in the state of New Jersey is not anything new. It really provides you the roadmap on how to make decisions that will have a stronger impact versus, myself, Shavonda Sumter, and a small group of individuals coming up with legislation of what we think is best. This opens up democracy for us really to have a plan on the repairs that we're looking to have redress for in the state of New Jersey.
That was really thorough and so clearly explained. As an organization that focuses so much on civic engagement, I really appreciate hearing that express that emphasis on making everyone's voice heard as you make policy choices. Mr. Brutus, as legal counsel who specifically focuses on economic justice, can you elaborate on the need for this policy step to address economic disparities and their broad impact? As a gender justice organization, we would also love it if you could highlight any ways that this helps achieve gender justice as well as closing economic gaps.
Sure. So first, I want to thank the Assemblywoman for raising up the Institute's forthcoming report coming out next week on the 24th to New Jersey's. My colleague, Laura Sullivan, is the author of the report. It'll have a lot of new information and new numbers on the racial disparity and racial wealth gap in New Jersey. I would ask, anyone who's listening to go to njisj.org/say the word. Once again, I'll say that again, njisj.org/say the word. And there, you're going to see some beautiful graphics, right, for some very serious information, right, regarding various racial disparities along a series of institutions in New Jersey, right? You're going to see the massive racial wealth gap in New Jersey, one of the highest in the country, right? You'll see a number there that is particularly concerning, right? Just a few years ago, the median wealth for Black individuals was $179, right? That's less than some sneakers, okay? And so I think that's important. So part of, these policies and part of what the repair is going to do is going to address these racial disparities, right? In terms of gender, right? Black women are overly burdened, are the most, of all demographic groups, have the highest debt burden for student loans, okay? They make, I believe about 55 cents on the dollar compared to white men. Right? Also, they're more likely to be incarcerated. If you're incarcerated, you can't, and we understand the effects of what it means to be a formerly incarcerated person finding a job. They're more likely to be incarcerated than white women, right? So part of the effects of repair and addressing these concerns is going to address these kinds of downstream economic effects. Also, Assemblywoman Sumter talked about maternal health for Black women, right? Or disproportionately affected, even when you control for class, right? And Serena Williams is a great anecdotal example, as Assemblywoman Sumter pointed out, right? The stresses of health, right? Things of when negative health effects disproportionately affect you, that's going to affect your ability to partake in the economy, right? And be a productive member of the economy. So part of the purpose of these economic policies would have those kinds of positive effects on Black women and on issues of gender, right? Issues of, and as we understand, I want to go back to that idea that I don't want to leave it, that Black women are disproportionately burdened by student loan debt, because what this does is this delays important milestones like purchasing a home. And we know that home ownership is a significant part of creating wealth. And that's part of one of the reasons for this massive racial wealth gap is maldistribution of wealth through home ownership, right? So one of the things that we need to think about is how repair is going to address and close that gap. And also, I just want your listeners and people watching to get this, right? We were talking about slavery and then we're talking about the contemporary moment. But in between that time period, it is something that happened, something significant happened as well, right? I want to talk about the period of Jim Crow and even in New Jersey, right? After slavery, it wasn't like this period in which the US and New Jersey just allowed Black life and Black life chances to flourish, right? At the state level, the federal level, the local level, there was concerted effort, a state sanctioned policy design to undermine Black life chances, right? Reconstruction was a brief period of time. And as the great Du Bois said, the slave went free, stood briefly in the sun, and then went back towards slavery, right? And so you had redlining, you had Jim Crow, you had sharecropping, you had all kinds of ways excluding Black people from the GI Bill, excluding Black people from the positive benefits of the New Deal, right? Over and over again, you see this undermining of Black life chances. And so then we had the contemporary moment with mass incarceration, or what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow, right? So these things are all sort of the afterlives or the children in some ways of slavery, right? These kinds of policies. And so these are what we're dealing with at the current moment that produces the kinds of economic inequalities that need to be repaired and addressed through a reparations program, and that the task force would study and address and think about, and particularly issues around gender, as Assemblywoman had addressed. And also, things like student loan burdens, how do we address that? How do we make college more affordable? How do we close it? How do we create conditions to make it easier for Black women to buy homes and to build wealth, all right? How do we decrease the incarceration rate? How do we increase access to the vote, right? So people can make decisions about how much economic power they have, what kind of access to economic power they have.
Good, thank you. Assemblywoman, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, it was thorough, but I just think it just ripples out so far. Actually, could we talk about the idea of household wealth a little bit? It's a concept that, you just mentioned it, and I'm sure you both have a lot to say on it. I didn't really understand it fully until, I probably still don't, but I started understanding it more fully recently. And how significant debt is for people who don't have generational wealth, and how the legacy of enslavement impacts that, and why when you said that household wealth is $179, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you have $179 in your pocket, right? It's like a lot bigger than that.
So thank you for that question and wanting to take a deep dive there. And as we learn more, it was important. We came off of a federal campaign and a big promise draw in for youth voters. And I have a 23-year-old daughter and a 22-year-old son, was the reduction of student loan debt. In New Jersey, we've done, and I'm a product of the Educational Opportunity Fund, making sure that first generation students have an opportunity to go to college. And then the thought was, and my parents told me this, I told my children this, was that it would create opportunities for you to earn more so that you could grow your wealth. Well, lo and behold, we sit here today and we're learning that Black women are saddled with more debt, and just the opposite has happened, where they cannot purchase a home, where they're in their 40s having their families now, have to be relegated to a certain zip code for affordability and for a school district as well. We didn't talk about the education segregation, which is still prevalent in the state of New Jersey because they can't afford better housing, better zip code for a better education system for their own families. All of this compounds to not building any assets, not building any type of retirement plan, not having any security in wealth or in the bank for a rainy day fund. Everything is urgent at this point. And it's upside down because they followed through, they being we Black women, with what we were told was part of the American dream. Do good, go to school, get good grades, and you'll find that opportunity for you that's going to help catapult you to whatever it is that your future is going to be. And that's not happening, let alone with the reality that you have more Black men incarcerated in the state of New Jersey for a woman who has a college degree. And we don't even have that conversation to be able to build a family for a dual household income. All systemic structural breakdowns of the family that has impacted us adversely and has been oppressive. So these are deeper social constructs that are a consequence of slavery, a consequence of redlining, a consequence of systemic and structural lockouts from lending as well for us that we don't give enough time and thought to. And that's why these conversations like we're having tonight are so important. So, we can take a pause and take a breath and say, how did we get here? And now that we know how we got here, is how do we prevent it from happening in the future? And if we don't put the brakes on and pass legislation similar to my reparations task force, so start taking that deep dive, we will make the same mistakes of history.
Could you speak to the benefits cliff at all? It's a term that I was introduced to recently, and this might be a great area for you to dive in, Jean-Pierre, about where once you get to a certain level of economic achievement, all of a sudden you find yourself maybe in more debt. If you're familiar with the concept I'm talking about in that term.
So this is the term is new to me, but I guess the concept itself is perhaps not new. In the sense that Black women are some of the most educated demographic, right? And part of that is becoming one of the most recent educated demographics is that they have to take on more loans. Black people have to take on more loans to pay for school, in part because in the 1960s, when the universities were open to a greater and larger population, you see the simultaneous retreat of public investment in universities, meaning people had to go take out loans to pay for school. All right. And increasingly, as you see more and more Black women in particular, getting higher degrees and more degrees and becoming more educated, they're taking out more and more loans. Now, 20 years after graduating from college, most white students have paid off 90%, 95% of their loans. As opposed for Black borrowers, they're holding on to 95% of their loans, right? Now, white families purchasing homes can rely on previous generations to help make a down payment, right? These are benefits from the GI Bill, right? Essentially, we can think of the GI Bill subsidizing the white middle class, right? While simultaneously disinvesting in Black people, right? You can see exclusion from FHA, right? Part of what the FHA would not insure loans for Black homes, right? Or if there were attempts to integrate, different neighborhoods, right? The federal government would not allow this to happen. So the building of wealth, part of purchasing a home requires a single down payment. That's not just coming from income. It's coming from previous wealth, from previous generations that's accumulated, right? That's sedimented. The Assemblywoman talked about cracks. Well, the part of the foundation is the sedimentation of wealth, generation after generation of building up, while for Black people, it's being drained, right? It's being undermined, it's being taken away from. So when you talk about benefits clips of people rising, getting more education, but taking on more of a debt burden, right? And not realizing the dream. And then also, when Black people are able to buy a home, their homes are undervalued, right? When you take appraisals of homes for Black people, housing appraisal, Black people's homes are being undervalued if a Black person is being associated with their home or their neighborhood. And if you were to do something, you see this coming out of the California Reparations Task Force testimony from Black families demonstrating, this kind of pernicious, insidious effect of racism, right? So there's going to be a big need for a robust kind of civil rights litigation in combination with economic justice to ensure that when when you have access to credit, when you increase the wealth of Black people, it's buttressed, backed up by powerful civil rights laws to ensure that there's not this pernicious sort of back end undermining of Black wealth, right? And so there is this kind of association of Blackness with devaluation, particularly in housing appraisals, particularly in homeownership, particularly with Black neighborhoods, right? And this has a long history, which was actively encouraged by the federal government throughout the 20th century.
Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted. There are so many other conversations I wish we had time to have this evening. You're raising so many points about things that I want to know more about or would like to talk more about for our audience members. As a mother of young children, when I heard the term benefits cliff, it talked about how your childcare gets subsidized, for instance, or your housing up to a certain point. But then once you pass an income threshold, suddenly you don't get that anymore. But childcare, as anyone with small children knows, in New Jersey is so prohibitively expensive that if you come from a family where the grandparents who might be able to provide free childcare are still working because they haven't been able to save for retirement, because they don't own their own home and don't have that equity to use to invest in their own future or to help out family members invest in theirs, then suddenly you see this issue where, well, do I take a higher paying job or do I keep the subsidy so I can afford to work because of childcare costs? Obviously, that's one very dear to my heart. But before we get into our Q&A, I actually have one more question. I mentioned this earlier. I did not know until last year that the 13th Amendment outlaws the practice of slavery, except in the case of someone who's been convicted of a crime, which is where vagrancy laws come from in a lot of cases. So functionally, slavery isn't illegal. And the overwhelming majority of crimes committed in the state of New Jersey are not violent. They're related to property, burglary, robbery, theft. And while Black citizens make up, from what I've read, 14% of New Jersey's population was the last statistic I saw, they make up more than half its prison population. So how does reparations become one of the answers to solving this problem?
That's a loaded question. I don't know that it solves it. And I like to be clear on this. As I talked to a descendant of an Asian family whose family received $20,000, it doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't erase the lost time. It doesn't erase the unfair treatment and the trauma that's caused by that. It does not. However, it does help to move towards healing. It does help to move towards creating your own story of how you choose to live and thrive and having access and the ability to participate in a future that you want to design for yourself and your family. And that's what we want to create. When you have charges, even for ticketing, parking tickets, right? That lands you in jail with the charge because you couldn't afford to pay it. The records were lost. I mean, I've heard countless stories that were simplistic, that just went bad too quickly. And it became a life sentence for individuals. And as you mentioned, these are not the violent offenders. This was somebody who may have been young and dumb, joyriding, got caught up, and made a mistake. So should have that opportunity at a second chance. But we did a lockout game in New Jersey and an over enforcement on Black and brown young men in particular that left a life sentence staying on them, rooted in slavery, rooted in labor, forced labor, so that they can continue to fix our roads and our highways, right? So looking at all of this with thought leaders and what type of repair we need to see today and in what spaces. And how do we provide supportive and prevention and educational opportunities and lending opportunities for people to build a sustainable life here in New Jersey as people of color is really what I'm looking forward to as the charge with this legislation.
So briefly, Alyssa, so you're talking about the benefits cliff. This is something that a lot of my clients in my previous position had to face, right? And that comes out of a particular history in which what we call the welfare system in the US, in subsidizing things like childcare, right? There is a way in which it was penalized and associated with, particularly with Black women coming out of, the 70s and the 80s. So there is a particular history there for why there is such a thing as a benefits cliff as you rise up. Secondly, in terms of reparations addressing this question that you asked about overrepresentation of Black people who are incarcerated, right? I think part of the task force will have to look at issues like public safety and policing. But I think when you begin to address the other aspects like housing, like education, all these other institutions, right? They're connected. They have an effect on each other. If you begin to address those other institutions, you're going to see decreases, right, in the incarceration of Black people. But yes, there has to be a discussion, and that's part of the reason why there's a task force to talk about policing and public safety. And then there has to talk about what are the underlying conditions that lead to this. What is this disinvestment in Black communities and communities of color? What can we do to invest more, right? How can we address issues of employment opportunities, education segregation, right? Health outcomes, right? Preschool, 3K, things like this, right? Those are the questions we need to address because those have an effect on rates of incarceration, as well as policing and issues of public safety. And they're linked together. So economic issues and issues of public safety and policing are connected. They're linked, as are issues, democracy issues, issues of voting, and health outcomes, right? Those are all interlinked. So you have to address one and the other as a series of linked issues to address that concern that pops up in terms of incarceration, right? It's all connected in a way, and I don't want to be trite about that, but that is how we need to approach it.
I think you might have just given the best definition of structural racism I've ever heard. The way everything is interconnected, you just really elaborated that so eloquently. Thank you. As we have, 10, 15 minutes left, I'd like to open it up for questions. I see that some people have put questions in the chat box. If you would type those in the Q&A, that will help us see them and not have to sort through. There is one question that I do see in the chat box that asks specifically about discrimination against people of color in regard to where they can buy property now, kind of the legacies of redlining. And you've spoken to that a little bit, Assemblywoman, but could one or both of you elaborate on the way that still exists today?
Sure. So redlining, and I love Senator Booker's story. When his parents went to buy their house in Bergen County, they sent a Jewish lawyer who was a friend to close on the house. So he was able to buy the house. And then when his father showed up, he tells the story of the man came out with a dog and set the dog on him. And the dog got bigger and bigger with each story because they didn't want Blacks in their neighborhood. So that's, the humorous story, but some truth in that story where we were not allowed to live in certain zip codes. They would lock us out, would not lend to us, would not even show us the properties in those neighborhoods. Today, what we're seeing is being priced out of even some of the urban communities with zoning restrictions, with high rises, not having family units, luxury apartments where you have a family of 4. So it's coming in different forms. Also, some of the I think Jean-Pierre mentioned some of the FHA housing restrictions, and then we have the affordable housing issue where you're just trapped, you're not getting credit for the rent that you're paying on time. So you're not able to build up a credit profile so that you can even apply for lending, or you don't have anyone to co-sign an agreement for you so that you can even buy a car. So we're continuing to see this, not being able to send your kid to a school, a regional school, because they have a certain number of kids that they can only accept from this zip code. So it's real today. And I have parents calling me, as you mentioned, childcare. The most heartbreaking story is a kid who wants to go to the vocational technical school, has good grades, but can't go because they're only accepting a certain number of students from that zip code. And the local school doesn't even have that shop fully built out for them to go to the local high school. There's a disparity there. So we're really trying to break the code, break down those walls. The Mount Laurel decision for affordable housing that where we won in court, and you still had communities going back to court and not wanting to allow affordable housing in their communities, and people can't retire there because they're no longer earning the type of money that they once earned and have to leave the communities that were home to them. And that's a health consequence, a socialization consequence as well. So it's real. It's real, and it's still here today.
I think the person who asked the question is implicitly asking, after 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, why is there still residential segregation in New Jersey? All right, why do we, if we took a map of New Jersey pre-1968 and post-1968, why is it, very similar? And part of the purpose of the task force would be to study that. And perhaps you could have, as Assemblywoman Sumter had alluded to, test or actors or agents to go out and to see if Black people are being steered to particular neighborhoods. Maybe there are what kind of practices, what kind of things are going on to reproduce these kinds of residential segregation patterns in New Jersey. And I think that would be something that, the task force would have to consider and have to look at seriously. And I think it's a wonderful question. I believe you're on mute.
Sorry, my mouse isn't working well today either, apparently. There's another question, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure I completely understand it, so you'll have to tell me if you do. Well, the first one is, where can we find the text of the bill online? And maybe Shaylin can make sure that it's going to everyone and drop that in the chat box so everyone can read it, because everyone will be able to see the question answered in the Q&A box. But the other question was, would regionalization lower property taxes, enhance curricula, and desegregate the school systems all at once? And I am not sure I understand what regionalization is, but maybe you do.
Give me that question again. I'm sorry.
It said, would regionalization lower property taxes, enhance curricula, and desegregate the school systems at once?
That was the intent. So I don't know that it met the goal. The intent of regionalized schools was to desegregate, was for either a county or a multiple town school system. It was supposed to lower property taxes and also provide economies of scales for experts in different subject matter, technical for students who may not have wanted to go to college but wanted to go into a trade as an option or a skilled field. So that was the intent. Right now, we're not seeing the results of that. I think you need to look at your county taxes. In my county, Passaic County, I can say that we've gone 2 years with no property tax increase. But on the local level, I've had property tax increases. So you really need to take a deep dive into one of your towns, and it's 21 counties in the state of New Jersey.
Are schools in New Jersey funded by local property taxes? I know it's different from state to state. Okay.
Yes.
So that's where you see some of those education disparities then, is people whose children can go to school in wealthier counties where properties are valued higher, get better educational outcomes because of resources.
Correct. And although we have court case precedents, for a thorough and efficient education to be provided to all students in the state of New Jersey. We're also trying to fund pre-K, universal pre-K for all as a state initiative for children of the state of New Jersey and a benefit to the families of New Jersey.
Fantastic. So we have this is a historical question about the GI Bill. Did it discriminate directly against Black veterans, or was that an after the fact practice, or was it specific banks, or was it really federal policy?
So if you want to find out more about this, I would say you should read Ira Katz-Nelson, the historian, When Affirmative Action Was White. He specifically addresses this issue. It was government policy, it was state sanctioned. It happened at the state level, the federal level, and the local level. I believe something like a very small number of Black GIs received received the GI Bill, right? Something like 3,000, a very small amount compared to the number of white GIs who received the GI Bill. And they found that they could not use, when the small amount that did were beneficiaries, could not use it in sort of the new suburbs that were being subsidized, right? Like the Levitt towns, they were being excluded. Even though some of them participated in building those very suburbs, right? They were excluded from living there. So it was both state sanctioned and policies and practices at the private level as well. So it was federal government at the state and the local level. And I would, if you want to read a great text about this, a great work, Ira Katz-Nelson's When Affirmative Action Was White, as well as Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. They both address this. They go more in depth on this, and then you can find out more about this, particularly if you're interested in how the GI Bill functioned and also limitations of the New Deal in terms of addressing racial inequality. Part of the reason is that FDR had to exclude, or at least the reasoning was he excluded a lot of jobs that were disproportionately filled by Black people to get the legislation passed at the time, to have Southern Democrats participate.
That's a conversation we hear a lot. We've been having a lot in programs lately about the political expediency and the sway of Southern Democrats. We talk about it a lot with Alice Paul and the infamous suffrage parade of 1913, where while not ultimately a segregated parade, they did not encourage all of the Black sorority women and women who asked to support the parade and to be included. They actively discouraged many of them from participating because they were afraid. Alice Paul specifically was afraid that the white Southern Democrat women wouldn't join, and she said that she needed their money to get the bills passed. And so we see this political expediency that is functionally racism, just over and over and over again. And when the students I work with ask, well, what would have happened if she hadn't? I say, I have no idea, but we know what happened because she did. We are really running out of time here, but I do want to ask, a few people have been saying in the chat and in Q&A, how can they get involved in calling for this bill to pass and for supporting this at their local level?
Thank you for that. So the bill number is A938. I'm not sure if it's in the chat, but it's Assembly Bill A938. I would love if everyone in the chat would do emails to the speaker to post the bill for a hearing. We're requesting a hearing so we can get on record thought leaders on how they feel about the bill, what more should go into the bill. As I saw in the different chats, people were asking what's in the bill. A938, reach out to Speaker Craig Coughlin, request a hearing for this legislation. The Institute for Social Justice, and maybe Jean-Pierre will mention this, also have a Say the Word campaign for reparations on their website. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Andrea. So go to 400yearsnj.org to call, email, tweet your legislators. We need to amplify the messaging that we care about this as New Jerseyans. It's our New Jersey, and we really should elevate what we care about. And I really need you as partners to help us in this work and getting this bill posted for a hearing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Assemblywoman Sumter, for raising up our phone to action plan. And thank you for Andrea for raising it up in the chat. Yes, 400yearsnj.org. Go there, right? And you just fill in your mission. It's automatically there for you to fill out your information. It will call, it will tweet for you, and it will email. And most importantly, call Assembly Speaker Coughlin, call Senate President Scutari, and ask them to post the bill for a hearing in the committees this Black History Month, right? Let's use the momentum, the focus of Black History Month to get them to post a bill this month, and let's build momentum to get this bill passed, right? So this month, let's use Black History Month and to call them out and to ask them and show your interest, support, and all you have to do is fill out your information and we'll automatically send it to them, right? So you just 400yearsnj.org, all right?
Again, what I tell the young people I work with, as well as my peers, your local representative should groan when they see your number come up on their speed dial. Save it in your cell phone, call on your commute to work, hands-free, of course, and just say, hi, here's who I am, here's where I live. I want to know what you're doing to get this passed. They should know your name. It takes 5 to 10 minutes out of your day, and it's your responsibility to be engaged in the civic process. We're here at API because we are enthusiastic about the work of Alice Paul, about women's enfranchisement and political legacy, about gender justice, about social justice. You got to put your money where your mouth is, make those phone calls and do the work. We don't have to go, we don't have to get force-fed in jail to do this work. We can just make a phone call on our cell phones. So I encourage you to do it. If you want to save this chat, go into the bottom of your chat box. There's the little page icon, the emoji icon, and the little 3 dots that says more. Click it, click save chat, and you'll have it all. This video should be up on our YouTube channel next week, so you can watch it for free forever and get the resources there. Please email me, programs@alicepaul.org with more questions. If you didn't catch anyone's email address or information, you can reach out to me there and I will get it to you. And we bring these programs to you for free. So if you would like to support us in continuing to do our work, we would be so grateful if you could pop on over to our website, alicepaul.org, and make a donation. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your Tuesday night to join us. We really appreciate it. And Jean-Pierre, Assemblywoman Sumter, thank you for this incredible conversation.
Thank you for having us. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having us, and good night, everyone.